Hi, everyone. Welcome to week 8. We're going to do a little bit of a different video lecture in that I'm going to divide the lecture between Saskia Sassen's lecture on exclusion is about 25 minutes and my own lecture on language inclusion and exclusion. So language and especially English, the role of English in a globalized world. And I'm sorry, the point of this of these two different lectures is on one hand because Saskia Sassen is a very engaging speaker and she's one of the authorities really on migration exclusions, and I think it's good for you to hear from her, but also because the point that I'm trying to make and that I want you to really reflect on is on this sort of invisible discourses around migration um, that that we don't really see on the media. So I want you to have to keep that in mind when watching these two different lectures, because then on the one hand, Saskia Sassen lecture on expulsions will point out certain invisible reasons around migration. My own lecture on language in a globalized world and the different inclusions and exclusions have to do precisely with these hegemonies that we take for granted around speaking English, around migrants speaking that English, right? So before you get into the lecture, I want you to keep in mind the following. While on the first place, watch Sassen's presentation, which is around 25 minutes. Think about these invisible reasons that she will be talking about, especially mid-lecture, and thinking about at 3 levels: at the transnational level, from the migrations from the global south to the global north; at a national level, from rural to urban areas; and also within big cities, within what we call global cities, from the point of view of what is usually called gentrification, but it's a little bit more, it's a little bit, not, in fact, it's a much more complicated than simply gentrification. So the expulsions that take place at the margins of cities, right? And why is that taking place and how those affected are more and more people, not just the poorest members of that city, right? And second thing is when you're thinking about those invisible reasons, I really want you to keep in mind the documentary Free. If you couldn't watch the entire documentary, at least I need you to watch until there is this twist revealed in the documentary. I don't want to spoil it, but there is a twist in the documentary around why the protagonist is hiding his identity and the reasons of his migration. Once you know that, I think it's safe. You can have a good picture around these one other invisible reasons, and you have enough material to compare that narrative that we see on the media that is usually very unnuanced, very straightforward, and that treats migrants and refugees simply as victims, i.e., without much agency. And then you have enough material then to get a more complex picture and start digging into these invisible reasons that you don't see on the media, right? Finally, before watching my lecture and what follows around language, I also want you to keep in mind how language, especially migrants and refugees that are part was considered these minority languages, whereby their language identity and their language is considered unpractical, useless, too small, right? And think about how that creates a type of linguistic expulsion that it's really within the realm of identity, within the realm of the self, and that's another another layer to the different migrations, right? So we have seen these 3 different layers of around the transnational level, the national level, and at the global city level. Then there is the layer of the self, of the migrant self. and how language will play that part. So with that in mind, then you watched around the 30 minutes of my lecture, and at the very end, you have the questions for the tutorial. So in the next slide here, you have Saskia Sassen on migration. So please go here and watch it. And then after this, you can watch my own take on language in a globalized world. Because the nature of language and the divide between because of the nature of language within our current communication systems is thought of as neutral, as a communication device that allows different actors to send messages to each other, right? And to a certain extent, that is true. Now, within this transnational arena, what is happening is that we have two different linguistic mindsets, and they're simultaneous. One takes its practice on the everyday level and is multilingual. And another one, it takes place at the theoretical institutional level and tends to be monolingual. And even when we have these tensions, when we look at national networks, they're plagued by this monolingual mindset. That is, what you see in most national, not transnational networks, is the idea of one nation, one language. Even though sometimes it's not made explicit, is thought of implicitly. The case of Australia is a very good one. At the level of practice and history and politics, you have a multiplicity of languages, of indigenous languages. At the level of the institutions, also at the everyday. So these two different levels are not mutually exclusive, but they're simultaneous, remember. Then you have an English monolingual mindset. The idea that this polemic a couple of years ago about requiring English tests to become citizens, it's just a symptom of this monolingual mindset that obviously is not unique to Australia, but it is really a feature around the world. Now, what I'm trying to point out in this discussion is precisely this idea that I want us to unpack today, is the idea that languages are not neutral. That especially when we are looking at these transnational interactions that take place in a language, that language is not just a mere tool of communication. And from this point of view, we're going to start looking at what different aspects this language as a linguistic mindset or a linguistic mindset. So language in general, the universal language of that provides a linguistic mindset, whether that be monolingual, multilingual. What are the aspects that are there underneath this unneutrality of language? And then, of course, we need to start. The first one is the equation between language and culture. And this is a really interesting one because language and culture are absolutely interrelated and are intrinsic to each other. And their relationship points precisely at the first sign that language can't be neutral. Now, the really interesting thing is that culture, it's always contextual. It is contingent to a moment in history, to a political time, and is relative to a language community. And when I say a language community, sometimes the threat of losing that language community is what makes that culture relevant too. So we have multiple examples of this, of the relationships of cultures that have lost their original language, so to speak, and then put quote unquote in the idea of originality when it comes to language, but so we understand each other. But precisely that loss, it what gives that culture relevance. I'll give you an example. The Puerto Rican community in the United States, the diaspora, Puerto Rican diaspora, second generation, most of them don't speak English. Don't speak Spanish and just speak English. But the loss of Spanish as their quote unquote original language gives them a very important part of their cultural identity. It's what grants them. It's one aspect that grants them that cultural identity. So even in that moment, you can see how culture is always relative, and I'm using relative consciously, to a language community. The way it relates to that language community, it's there are multiple degrees, and then that's the interesting part. However, and here's the kick. While culture in that way could be chosen in the sense that it's contingent and that it needs this other part, language cannot be chosen. Language is inescapably biological. And I'm not trying to be deterministic here, because obviously language is not only biological. Language, there's an important component of language that has to do with our linguistic system that we can change. And typical example of theoretical linguistic is this idea of the critical period, in which if you are born in a country and you stay in that country and then you move to another country before the age around 14, 13, you can acquire multiple languages at a native speaker level. You can be a native of those languages, and there are different degrees, and that's called bilingualism, even trilingualism, right? And you can help that, even if no one taught you that. Your linguistic system, your biological linguistic system, will pick up the language without absolutely any effort on your part, simply by having enough input. So that biological component, the idea that you cannot really choose a language, is what makes it really interesting. Because once the language develops and gets attached to a culture, then is when things become quite messy. And then in this relationship between language and culture, in which you can't really choose what language should you speak and how you speak a second language after that critical period has passed, is not taken into account in governmental language policy around the world, because governmental language policy presents language as a neutral mechanism, as a neutral communication device, as something that you need to learn in the same way you need to learn democratic values, in the same you need to learn the history of a country, the same you need to learn a trade. And the problem is that not only language is intrinsically related to culture, there is another layer in which language is, there is a component that is biological, and then depending on your circumstances and your age, it might be really hard for you to actually learn that language, or even if you learn it, to present yourself as someone who has already learned the language or has mastered the language. So it gives you this appearance of not fitting in, because a problem that you cannot escape, precisely because of this biological nature. But governments do not look at this problem from that point of view, but they look at it from the problem and from a point of view of neutrality all over the world, right? So, and that's one of the reasons why I need to unpack the unneutrality of language. And this is connected to another way of looking at languages that, even though it's not so much neutral, but it's close to be unproblematic. When a language is seen and perceived and is known, in the case of English, to yield economic value, then that language is analyzed, seen from this not so much neutral point of view, but from this unproblematic point of view. You earn money with English, you trade in English, the uses of English is not really questioned. It is simply put as a value adding device. And that is simply kind of on the face of it. Obviously, when you start to unpacking that, you can see different, you can see underneath the surface, and this is what we're going to do. But this would be the second layer of that supposed neutrality of languages. And when I'm talking about this neutrality of languages, I don't want to convey the sense of that there is someone behind the shadows doing this neutral, adding neutrality to the language. What I want you to think is that this neutrality is taken for granted. It's something that we don't really think too much about, that we simply look at a language and no flags are raised when English is used as a language of business, for instance, when you're required to learn French to get your French citizenship, so on and so forth. Or what we think about the US as an English-speaking country, and just an English-speaking country, right? When we don't think too much about this is what I speak about neutrality. This is why I think neutrality is important, unpacking neutrality, because what I want us to see is go beyond the explicit, they're taken for granted. And because that will be really important to understand how these different transnational actors behave and understand each other. Yeah. So in this case, going beyond the economic rationality requires that we start thinking about language in terms of dominance, and hegemony, which really means in terms of power. What are the and the ability to add value? It's also the ability to it's an ability that it's born out of a certain type of power. So if we think about the economics of a language beyond that economic value, beyond the value as a communication device, then we have to think about the history of power that allows that value to be placed in the first place. And when power is able to allocate value on a language, that creates a linguistic mindset. And that linguistic mindset tends to be monolingual, although as we have seen in the other article on Timor-Leste, it could be also multilingual. And in different nation states, it could be also multilingual, although the picture is complicated. But it tends to be monolingual, right? So when the first distinction that we have to make is the concept of dominance, in which is a much more blunt instrument, so to speak. It's an explicit expression of power. And that explicit expression of power, it is what you see in stable institutions. You see it in the judiciary, in the education system, in the different type of state of powers in governments that governments use. And it stems from the root of it is whatever language or languages have been chosen, but most of the time is one language. The root of it is it is a history of political, military, and economic power over a community. In the process of creating a nation state. So let me repeat this. Dominance is explicit. It is rooted in a history of political, military, and economic power over a community or a set of communities in the process of creating a nation state. And now you have to go back historically to see in different specific examples of how that came about, because different nation states are created with different mythologies around this or that language. Yeah. So, but it's absolutely explicit. And for linguistic dominance to work, need to be explicit, and it needs to be visible. Then the second part, which is related, comes, which is hegemony. And linguistic hegemony, it is much more implicit. And it's the consequence or the aftermath of a linguistic dominance. And obviously, different aspects of this process of creating this nation state. And when I'm speaking of a nation state, I refer to the nation state because the nation state uses language as one of the tools of cohesion. And it's important to understand how the monolingual mindset, or this linguistic mindset, let's not call it just monolingual because it could be also multilingual. But this linguistic mindset, it is also rooted, it is also related to the creation of the nation state. And once that state is being forged, that's how we can start looking at how different nation states relate to each other, how within those nation states you can form transnational communities that can go beyond the nation state itself in different moments of history, right? But it's important that we understand that it really all began with the nation. This linguistic mindset in contemporary history really began with the nation state, with the creation of the nation state and the cohesion of an imagined community, an imagined national community that in which language play a major role, right? So once dominance has been established, once the nation state is stable and stabilized, and linguistic mindset has been placed, language has been given value, a certain amount of value, then hegemony is created. And sometimes it could occur simultaneously, but dominance always precedes hegemony. So this idea of hegemony comes from Italian philosopher Antonio Gramsci, and really the main point of hegemony, it's that you can not just it's not just the dominance of one group over the other, but how the dominant group can create consensus around their own dominance, around the validity of their own dominance. How the dominant group leads through consensus, through what Gramsci called organic structures. Power is organically, the power of the dominant is organically established in whichever community you're thinking of, in this case, the nation state. And the way this consensus and this consent is achieved is many times through cultural mechanisms. And here is the really interesting part to me. Because you don't need a blunt instrument as the police to establish your dominance over a different group, although it could be done, but it's not done as effectively as when you can actually secure it through a cultural device. And there are a myriad, a huge number of cultural devices. The one that comes to mind, it's the language of film, of Hollywood, for instance, when it comes, for instance, to English, to accepting English as a hegemonic language. Not just only English is the language of business, English also is the language of Hollywood. And Hollywood is a really effective vehicle to give credence, legitimacy to language. And this legitimacy is achieved, is a sign of hegemony. And that would be it, that is the end result of hegemony, or a hegemonic structure. And that's how we can acquire linguistic legitimacy. And this linguistic legitimacy can occur at the level of languages, but also within languages. We start thinking different accents, different mannerisms, and ways of expressing a language. But at the level of language, it really, and within the nation state, the important part of your legitimacy can be best seen in the interaction between the native speaker, and the non-native speaker. The native speaker carries intrinsically a linguistic legitimacy, because language, the way we use our language, carries authority. It is very important for non-native speakers to appear as native-like, as fluent-like, in order to carry authority and in order to give legitimacy to what they say. If not, you can be perceived very quickly as maybe not serious, but not mastering the content of your speech, which is the opposite for native speakers. Yeah. So in that example, you can see how even within a language, you can see legitimacies playing out, right? And the idea of English being the language of business, that language that is legitimized to carry business, even though, again, as we saw in Green's article, is not the only language, but is certainly the dominant language. And that's why it's interesting, and it's a good example to analyze. Underneath that legitimacy is not is not a simple neutrality. It's not simply a neutral choice of a linguistic communication device. There is a value placed into it that has taken into effect due to a dominance, a hegemony, and finally an established legitimacy. And this takes us to my last point, which is that these linguistic hegemonies that creates different linguistic legitimacies are also geopolitical. They tell us something about the transnational politics of the world, and how different asymmetries are created due to these competing linguistic legitimacies. The case of China, Chinese, and English today is a good example of that. But the case of Spanish until the 19th century was another one. Spanish and English at the time, Spanish and French before in the 16th century. And the way geopolitics work today, as opposed to before nation states were created, or before the legitimacy of languages within nation states were established, is through hegemonic mechanisms. And the way we can look at English as being a legitimate means of communication is precisely because it achieved a dominant position right after the Spanish Empire fell in 1898 with the so-called loss of the last colonies in Puerto Rico and the Philippines. How the British Empire managed a position of military dominance around the world, and commercial dominance, and colonial dominance, and how that was substituted after World War II by the US, by US hegemony. And those are the reasons. Those are one of the reasons why English is hegemonic, and why English and any other languages are not just neutral tools of communication. And this non-neutrality, these different layers, is what's really, really important when we start thinking about the interaction of transnational actors. And this is the first level of interaction, which is at the language level, at the most basic level, the level of communication. Okay.